Okay, I know I'm late to the discourse, but I don't care. Apple Music recently put out a list of the 100 best albums of all time, and it's honestly fine. I know everyone's pressed that Taylor Swift made the top 20 while Crazy Frog's Greatest Hits wasn't mentioned at all, but I'm glad we're past the point of the entire top 10 being dominated by Beatles, Stones, and Pink Floyd albums. That being said though, I couldn't help but think of how I would make this list if I were an executive at Apple Music. This isn't just a list of my favorites, because if it were I'd probably be fired. Rather, I pick these albums based on how impactful they are in their respective genres, and if they capture something that no other album has been able to since. Obviously, it's still a very biased list. There's not a ton of country, metal, classical, or music that's not in English on here, but having crunched the numbers a few times, I think I'm happy with what I have. Without further ado, let's get into it. The most unpredictable album from an electronic legend captures everything from pretty ambience to fork in a blender core very tastefully. The very sequel to pop music itself that would actually predict a lot of trends moving forward. Really tight track list with a ton of big features and production from some of the PC Music Co. You know lo-fi hip-hop beats to relax and study to? Well, guess what? It owes itself to this anime soundtrack. Rest in peace to the big man Nujabes. Okay, half of you probably just clicked off, but this is easily the most influential project of the 2020 so far, and I think deserves a spot regardless. Not only is this one of the best arranged indie projects ever, but Joanna Newsom's music still isn't on Spotify except for the Muppets theme. I'm surprised Apple didn't use this as an opportunity to flex. Peak Cowboy Emoji Core, baby. Happy to see this one actually made the list. I put it in the same spot, partially because I didn't want to make another graphic for it, but also because it's a beautifully dreary, drunken, nighttime electronic record that changed the course of the genre. Can you believe this is what dubstep used to mean? The minimalist piece of all time. If you haven't heard it, your high school band instructor certainly has. A cornerstone in the world of freaky electronic music where the beats kind of sound like you could rap over them, i.e. trip hop, as well as one of the sexiest albums ever made. Set a new standard for sample-based music. When they paired the riff from the Beatles' The End with a lick from James Brown's Get Up, Get Into It, Get Involved, and then randomly interrupted it with a reggae song about not sniffing coke, music was changed forever. The mighty double LP from the legend himself. The only studio album he made with 2 songs that passed the 13-minute mark so that he could really flex those guitar muscles. One of the most creative ambient projects of all time. He made a song out of a gum commercial. The most recognizable album in bossa nova, and one that never fails to set the mood. Brought Chicago drill into the mainstream and changed the landscape of hip-hop. Few albums from the 2010s have as many timeless hits as this one. One of the best produced albums of the last 20 years, and some of Lana's best songwriting and performances to date. Plucky grooves, big brass, lyrics about equality, a 14-minute jam sesh song. Pretty much everything you could ever want out of a funk album is here. An acoustic blues record that feels like sitting by a fire on a cold night. Her finger-picking style was ahead of its time and has aged immaculately. People thought this album was too experimental when it came out, which I think is a testament to its influence. You hear other experimental albums from around this time, and parts of them are still kind of freaky, but Pet Sounds? Really? Metallica polished up their thrash sound just enough to be catchier while still kicking so much ass. One of the most intimate and electrifying indie rock albums ever. It also has the Blowjob song on it. Zappa's sharpest and catchiest prog record with all the goofy jazz elements that are as technically impressive as they are silly. Set a new standard for production in hip-hop, and still has some of the best bass lines that I've ever heard on any album. Some of the most mind-bending glitch hop you'll ever hear stacked on top of one of the best noise rock albums ever made. Arguably the first ever concept album, except for maybe this one, and has some of Sinatra's best songs on it. Of everything on this list, I'd say I'm most surprised that this one didn't make the actual top 100. An electronic album made to be listened to by plants, so much so that you could only get it by buying a plant from a store in LA in the 70s. It'll make you feel like a plant. An Afrobeat album that was so good at criticizing the Nigerian military, it resulted in 1,000 soldiers attacking Fela's commune and throwing his mother out of a building. God damn. The music's really good though. The most timeless DC hardcore album ever, with its unique vocals and reggae tracks. Biting political commentary told on every kind of upper you can imagine. The feeling of floating around aimlessly with little control or reason. Rest easy, Mac. Sex didn't exist before this album. Virginity didn't exist before this album. Nice. Also, this motherfucker made beatboxing sexy. How do you even do that? Legitimately has more personality than any singer-songwriter album I've heard, and every track is unforgettable. It also represents the anti-folk genre, although nobody knows what that means. The zenith of funk and psychedelic rock coming together. Ornette Coleman had the balls to make a jazz record that if you put it on at a fancy restaurant, people would probably get up and leave. But if you sat down and listened to it, your mind would be blown. Big hair, fishnets, weird guitar tones, songs that are just as catchy as they are dark and overwhelming. Goth rock doesn't get much better than this. Kurt Cobain's Outsider album, and one of the most fascinating of the 90s. A diverse and unpredictable set of weird electronic songs that broke the boundaries of pop music. Rest in peace to this legend. The single most depressing album ever made. Perfectly replicates the feeling of living in your head and everything feeling weirdly distant. Man, everything would be so much better if we all just loved each other. A genre-defining album for Memphis rap, which is arguably the darkest subgenre of hip-hop. It's lo-fi, cold-blooded, and relentlessly catchy. Aretha's most consistent set of bangers, and one that I don't think will ever age. I can't name a single other glam rock album that embodies the eccentricism of the genre as well as this one. Amazing vocal performances, and some of the flashiest instrumentals of the era. The definitive sad boy with a guitar album that captures this buzzing nighttime ambiance like no other. An extremely meditative spiritual jazz record that'll make you feel like you're part of a sacred ritual. A genre-defining LP for Tropicalia, which is a more psychedelic and experimental take on Brazilian pop music, as well as one of the most detailed and varied albums of the 60s. Undoubtedly one of the best produced rock albums of all time, and far transcends the pop-punk genre it's associated with. Also, I bet you can't name a single rock opera that came out after this. I've honestly never really understood the term post-rock, but the inescapably eerie world that this band creates here is enough to completely redefine what rock music can be. Not much to this record other than an acoustic guitar, storytelling, and the shitty boombox it was recorded on, but that's part of what makes it so special. I'd say it's a must-listen for anyone interested in songwriting. Probably the best fusion of soul and hip-hop that the 90s has to offer. It also has the best album skits ever that put the tracks into a brighter perspective. This was number 1 on Apple's list, and I think it was a valid pick. An updated take on George Orwell's Animal Farm, but told as a progressive rock epic. The end result is the best album in Pink Floyd's catalog. DJ Screw's methods of recontextualizing songs into these slowed-down psychedelic fever dreams have drastically left a mark on music across the board, with so many artists paying tribute to him in some way. Even still, though, nobody else could do it like him. The most real and unfiltered look into a schizophrenic's nervous breakdown. 9 members all bringing completely different styles into some of the most cutthroat hip-hop of all time. I really wanted to put Supreme Clientele on this list, but I couldn't not give props to the whole group. A natural fusion of pop, hip-hop, and psychedelic rock that is yet to be replicated despite how much of the music world it's inspired. A fusion of jazz and funk that sounds like the two genres are fighting because they hate each other. Easily one of Miles' best fusion works. The artsy-fartsy rock album of all time, but one that's aged really beautifully. Parts of it are pretty, most of it is really dark, but it all works. I wanted to put White Light White Heat on this list too, because it's arguably the first ever noise rock album, and I think holds up better than a lot of this one, but ultimately I had to peel slowly and see. Admittedly, I don't know much about J-Rock, so there could be like 20,000 other albums that should be in this spot, but goddamn, I have not heard a rock album from the 21st century that has as much pizzazz and consistency as this one. Beyonce brings out a whole-ass brass ensemble in what feels like the performance she's been building to her whole career. Should have been as big as the Taylor Swift Eras Tour, damn it. I don't know if I can name you a single other album as universally loved as this one. Like, who the hell is gonna complain if you put on Daft Punk? Also, Interstellar 5555 is one of the best visual albums you'll ever watch. A brilliant concept album following the life of Biggie with one iconic track after another. His status as a top 5 rapper of all time is mostly because of this album, as it's literally the only one he put out during his lifetime, and it's fully warranted. The flows on this thing are so smooth and brought rap to a whole new level. It sucks that the version on streaming removed some of the samples though. While New Wave is just about the most dated genre tag of all time, there's still nothing that sounds like Remain in Light. The rhythms on this thing are so out of whack and pull a lot from funk and Afrobeat music, but have that 80s production and Talking Heads quirkiness that make it one of a kind. Combines a ton of different genres from all over the world while making you feel like the baddest bitch that ever lived. Even the throwaway tracks and the skits are really good. There still isn't a better album to smoke to than this one, except for maybe Doggy Style, which I wanted to put on this list because I personally prefer it, but The Chronic is more impactful and I couldn't not include it. Released a mere 2 months after the untimely passing of frontman Ian Curtis, Closer sounds like walking into a torture chamber, but the bass lines are so good that you can't escape. Yo grandma used to trip balls to this album. The most incomprehensibly depressing project in all of hip-hop that still blows my mind after literal thousands of plays. An extremely bizarre fusion of rock and electronic, and one of the most perfect winter albums of all time. Also, shout out to Apple Music for putting this in the number 33 spot so I didn't have to make a new graphic for it. A seamlessly sprawling pop record that bounces from numerous genres while telling a cool story. So many people worked on this thing, and it feels every bit as big as the personnel would have you believe. Janelle Monáe deserves a lot more hype, and I hope people recognize this as a classic in the future. The culmination of everything that goth rock was building up to in the 80s. I guarantee you by the end of the album you'll have black nails and a newfound addiction to cigarettes. Okay, I know I said Elliott Smith was the definitive sad boy with a guitar album, but I lied. If you're unfamiliar with Nick Drake, he was an English songwriter in the late 60s and early 70s, who wasn't very well known during his time, and unfortunately took his own life a couple of years after this album. In the 90s, the title track to Pink Moon was used in a Volkswagen commercial, and he's grown a big following since then. Even without any of that context though, Pink Moon is still one of the most beautiful albums I've ever heard, with guitar lines that are deceptively simple, and beautiful performances to complement them. A crowning jewel for southern hip-hop, with some of the funkiest and smoothest rap songs you'll ever hear. Andre and Big Boi's flows are somehow on and offbeat at the same time, which adds a lot to the futuristic vibe. the best written alternative rock album of all time. These songs cover really dark and taboo topics like anorexia, the death penalty, and prostitution, while having some of the most memorable hooks of all time. Much of the lyrics were written by the band's rhythm guitar player Richie Edwards, who would go missing not even a year after this album's release and never found again. A wonderful crossroad of numerous weird electronic genres that popped up throughout the 90s, being tied together with Bjork's iconic vocals and songwriting. The title track is the quickest 18 minutes of music you'll ever hear, and so are the other two songs. Prog doesn't get much better than this. Constantly exciting jazz fusion that'll make you realize how much you suck at playing guitar. Probably the saddest, loudest, and horniest album to ever go quadruple platinum. The first album in Kate Bush's catalog that she produced on her own, which explains why it sounds like a stage show that I'm watching through a crystal ball. Essentially the Bible for New York rap. I've never heard a big band piece with so much raw emotion that also swings as much as it does. It'll make you cry and dance at the same time. One of the most ambitious soul records ever recorded, with most of it being made up of a 12-minute cover of Walk On By and a 19-minute cover of By the Time I Get to Phoenix. Both of these songs belong to him now as far as I'm concerned, and it's amazing how not a second was wasted throughout this LP. It doesn't get much more country than Johnny Cash performing for a bunch of prison inmates. Some of the most consistently strong songwriting to ever grace music. I don't even know what else to say about it, it's just iconic. Absolutely unforgettable social commentary told over some of the best instrumentals of the era. Brought rock music to a higher plane of existence. This is what wizards listen to in the Harry Potter world. I don't know, I never read the books. Will undoubtedly give you chills, make you cry, or get under your skin in some way. Nina has one of the most recognizable voices in all of music that I don't think will be forgotten anytime soon. The greatest indie rock album ever made. Sounds like Midwest emo if all of the members had PhDs in both music and philosophy. The amount of detail beneath the surface on any given moment of this album is mesmerizing. An extremely talented and out there rapper collabs with an extremely talented and out there producer. These two matched each other's freak better than anyone, and gave us so many different musical ideas in such a short span of time that could be dissected forever. Rest in peace, Doom. One of the only pop albums where every song gets played a million times and I never get tired of hearing it. Rest in peace, Prince. The magnum opus for Germany's experimental rock scene in the late 60s and early 70s, i.e. krautrock, and one of the most ambitious and perfectly executed pieces of rock music ever recorded. The arrangements on this album are so lush and beautiful. I've never felt so many emotions in my life. Sounds like an alternate dimension soundtrack to an R-rated Disney movie that pays homage to classic American blues and jazz music. Also, if you're a recovering alcoholic, you can just listen to this album and you'll feel drunk. Another album I can never get tired of despite how many times I've heard songs from it. Also amazingly consistent considering it's almost 2 hours long. Pretty much the best 10 songs ever made. Perfectly embodies the dream pop genre with its ethereal production and lyrics that nobody knows because half of them are probably just gibberish anyway. Much like how when you're dreaming you don't fully comprehend everything. The greatest rock album ever made. Took full advantage of all studio trickery that was possible at the time and made something thoroughly challenging that still kicks ass and doesn't let up for a second. Too bad it came out the day after Dark Side of the Moon. Arguably the most influential album of the 2010s, and one that's aesthetic hasn't been replicated, not even by the other two in the trilogy. It pulls heavily from 80s goth music, even sampling Cocteau Twins and Susie and the Banshees, but did something completely different with it that would change R&B forever. Every song plays a pivotal role in the album's narrative and takes you into the world of this depraved drug addict. Uses the album format to tell a story in a really interesting way that ties it all together. Is also probably the best fusion of hip-hop, jazz, funk, soul, and spoken word ever recorded, while providing a very nuanced perspective from a poor black American rising to stardom. This is definitely me when I overcome my crippling drug addiction and find God. Not only is this genuinely one of the catchiest, best produced, and most varied pop albums ever that also laid the groundwork for a lot of pop music moving forward, but the music industry did Janet so dirty after 2004 for literally having tits. Meanwhile, her brother still gets played everywhere despite... I hate society. The fact that The Velvet Rope isn't usually mentioned alongside albums like Thriller, Dark Side of the Moon, and Abbey Road, despite having the critical and commercial success to back up such a claim, is a true travesty. But it also means that it hasn't been overplayed to the point of losing its charm, so if you haven't heard it yet, please get on that, it's fantastic. I almost had it at number 1, but it was beat out by... Released on Dilla's birthday, a mere 3 days before his passing, Donuts tells his entire life story using only samples from 45s. There's 31 tracks on here representing the 31 years in Dilla's life, and it's bookended by the same intro and outro to represent the circle of life. Almost like a big donut. The amount of genres and moods that are explored on here are constantly gripping without being overwhelming, and all flow together perfectly. Even without that context though, Donuts is still the golden standard for sample-based music, and acts as a grand celebration of music itself. Undoubtedly takes the number 1 spot in this list. What do you guys think? I know there's a ton of really big albums that I missed, but trying to narrow down every significant record from the entire history of music into 100 albums is literally an impossible task. Hell, I don't even think you could do it with 1,000. People are going to be pissed off regardless of what I put on here, so I figure it's best to not overthink it too much. Sorry to all the Swifties out there, but hey, Kanye didn't make the list either, so you can't get too mad. I put songs from all these albums together as a playlist on both Apple Music and Spotify, so check those out in the description if you're interested. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, you know the drill. No, I'm never gonna